Recently, our family has been dealing with such a diagnosis, not in our immediate family, but if you have seen what Tiffany has shared on Facebook in the last couple of days, her sister's husband has a brother that is 40 years old, married, has 4 kids, ranging from freshmen in college down to, I think, maybe middle school age, maybe a little younger. Faithful family, gospel preacher in northern Florida. Doctors have given him just a few days. And this has come on just within the last week and a half. Why cancer? He has a very aggressive tumor that has wrapped itself around his intestines. He can't eat, he can't drink. It's inoperable. Medicine will not touch it. Basically, they have said there is nothing. He is at peace. As I mentioned, that is one of the great blessings being a child of God, is being at peace with a diagnosis like this, but it's hard for those that remain. For those that are left wondering, why? And in such situations, faithful Christians will still ask, did someone do something wrong? Is this some sort of punishment for something? Why would God allow this? When the diagnosis hits close to home like this, it can cause us to question. Questioning is not wrong in and of itself, as long as we let God provide the answers. I want to state this very clearly from the start. Cancer is not direct proof that someone sinned. But cancer is proof that something is broken. You know, whether it be directly or indirectly, everyone has been impacted by this terrible disease. And everyone has been made to reconcile the following idea, that we are living between 2 gardens. We had the Garden of Eden at the beginning, where God had created everything to be just as it was supposed to be, perfection, to a degree that we can't even properly comprehend. And we wait for a restoration of that perfection. Not in the earthly bodily sense, but in the spiritual sense. Where there will come a time when there will be no more illness, no more pain, no more suffering of anything. But yet we find ourselves right now in the space between. Romans chapter 8, which is where we're going to spend a lot of our time this morning, explains that space in between the 2 gardens. But I want to begin first by knowing how everything started. Look back with me in Genesis chapter 1, going all the way back to the beginning. All the way back to when this was all created. When you go through Genesis 1 and then Genesis chapter 2, at the end of each day of creation, God observes what He has created and He says it is good. On day 6, as He observes the totality of His creation, we're told that He says it is very good. Very good in God's eyes was that which He created. At that time there was no death. There was no decay, there was no disease, there were no cells attacking the body that it was actually designed to serve. You see, at this time, cancer, it could not exist in a world where nothing died, where there was no death, where there was nothing broken. But death did enter, and it entered with sin. When sin became a reality, it created a fracture in God's creation. In Genesis chapter 3, we see the result, specifically in verses 14 through 24. I want you to glance at that with me. Genesis chapter 3. 14 through 24. This is after sin has been introduced. Eve has given in to the temptation presented by the devil. Adam followed suit in agreeing to partake of the fruit that his wife offered. As a result, there was consequences. But when you look through verses 14 through 24, you notice that Adam and Eve, they weren't the sole recipients of the consequences. Everything was. The ground was cursed. It was not going to easily produce its fruit anymore. It was going to be hard. It was going to be toilsome. There were going to be obstacles that were now in the way. What once grew freely was now going to struggle. Childbearing was cursed. It was not going to be a painless thing. A child was going to be brought forth, and it was going to be very, very painful. Human relationships, yes, were cursed because that perfection that had been created through God was no more. Access to the tree of life, no. Cannot have that anymore. You see, this was not just moral guilt that was the result of sin. It was cosmic disruption. Everything that was good and perfect, everything that God said was very good, was impacted and touched by the result of sin. Yes, there are personal implications. When we go over to the book of Romans, we see in Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." That's all of us. We all are guilty of sin. When you go to chapter 5 and in verse 12, you see that sin entered the world through one man, Adam, and in addition to that came death. Death has spread to all men. Why? Because all have sinned. A consequence of that sin. Reiterated in chapter 6 and in verse 23 when Paul says the wages of sin is death. Again, these are the personal implications to the seriousness of sin, but I want us to understand it extended beyond the person, but to everything. There are global implications. In chapter 8, Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 20, notice what Paul says. "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." Creation, Paul says, was subjected to futility. That was not its original state. It was made to endure the horribleness that we see. Creation is in bondage unto corruption. It groans. Have you ever been out in the woods, nice and quiet, and there's a good breeze blowing, and you can hear the trees cracking and groaning as they shift under the momentum of the wind? That's what I envision when I read this. That the entire creation is groaning like this because it is enduring something it wasn't supposed to: corruption. That word corruption means decay, breaking down, deterioration. And we stop and consider the overall theme of the message tonight. Why cancer? Cancer is a cellular corruption within the body, not personal punishment, but systemic decay within oneself. We are not being individually targeted. We are living in a world that is wearing out and that is subject to such horrible things because of the presence of sin. In John chapter 9 and verse 23, Jesus rejected the blame game view of sickness. And I think it's human nature, I guess, to want to blame. I mean, look, go all the way back to Adam and Eve. What was the first thing Eve did when confronted with her sin? Blamed somebody else. Blamed the serpent. What did Adam do when he was confronted with his sin? He blamed Eve. And ultimately, he blamed God because God was the one that created Eve. This is really your fault, Lord. We have a tendency to want to blame whatever it is on somebody else. We want to have someone we can direct our feelings towards because we feel helpless, overwhelmed. And in John chapter 9, beginning of the chapter, Jesus and his disciples come across a man who we're told was blind from birth. This man had never seen anything a day in his life. And Jesus' disciples asked Jesus, who sinned for him to be in this state? Was it he or his parents? Basically, what did he do to deserve this punishment? That's how they viewed it. Jesus' reply is, neither of them. This is not a result of direct sin. This is not, do not look for somebody to blame for this, that it's the fault of the parents or it's the fault of the man himself for having done something so atrocious. Jesus completely dismantled the idea that sickness equals specific sin. And this truth really matters. Now, parenthetical statement I'm going to insert right here. There are choices that we can make in our own lives that can increase the probability of sickness, even cancer. There are things we can engage in that make the probability higher that we will suffer because of something. But the idea that all sickness is equal to a specific sin, its retribution or its punishment, is not accurate. If we tie all cancer to some form of personal guilt, we crush people who are already suffering. We crush people that are asking these very questions themselves. Well, you must have done something. Kind of like Job's friends. You're going through this, that means you must have done something. Job's like, I can't think of anything. I haven't done anything. Well, the evidence is that you're suffering, so you did. Those that are met with a diagnosis like cancer often ask, what did I do? Where did I go wrong? And the answer may very well be nowhere. You did nothing wrong. To say, well, it must have been something. No, friends. Let's not play the blame game when it comes to issues like this. So what is cancer? Not from a I'm no doctor, right? You don't have to talk to me very long to understand that. I'm not going to go into this from a medical perspective. It's not a lightning bolt from heaven, okay? It's not divine retaliation because God said, you did something I didn't like, boom, there's cancer. That's not what it is. Cancer is evidence that death still reigns in this realm. Cancer is evidence that creation groans, is corrupted within this realm. Cancer is evidence that, yes, we are indeed east of Eden. See, back when Adam and Eve sinned and God put them out of the garden, sent them east, and put a cherubim with a flaming sword there lest they come back. We are not in the garden anymore. Cancer is what happens when a world designed for life is cut off from the source of life. When humanity stepped away from God, the fracture line ran through everything. Soil, storms, our very bodies, our DNA. And so many will say, well, that makes God this cruel and awful person. Why did he have to make it affect everything like that? Why couldn't he just affect something over here and something over there? Why did it have to affect everything? Because that's how serious sin is. It has broken everything that God ever called very good. It makes redemption necessary. The presence of cancer doesn't point to the cruelty of God, but there is something that we need delivered from. There is something in this world that transcends us that has caused this. Notice the attitude Jesus took about sickness. If disease was just the way it's supposed to be, that's just how it is. Can't do nothing about it. Jesus would have ignored it. But instead, what did he do? He healed illnesses. He restored physical conditions. He raised the dead. Every miracle was a preview. Yes, he was demonstrating who he was. Without a doubt, the Son of God, deity in the flesh. But through taking that which was broken and maimed and ill and making it whole, he was showing us this is what my Father intended. And not just that there would be perfection in the physical sense, but there needed to be perfection in the spiritual sense. We live in the groaning. We live in the in-between, but we do not live without hope. In Romans 8 and verse 23, Paul says, we also groan. Like the creation around us that groans because of the corruption that it is subjected to. We groan. We weep because of what others are experiencing. We weep because there is nothing we can do tangibly to help or to ease what they're going through. We sit in hospital rooms for hours upon hours. We groan, but we do not despair. Why? Because this body will be raised incorruptible. That's what Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We do not despair because we understand that there is more important things than this temporary existence. That there is coming a time in which all this will be gone and perfection will once again be around us. That's why we do not despair. We do not despair because of what John wrote in Revelation chapter 21. No more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. You see, cancer does not get the final word, resurrection does. That's why we do not despair. That's why we may groan, longing for what is to come, but we do not let it overcome us. Are we still pushed in the direction of asking questions? Why? What happened? How could God? Yes, we are. But we can always rest assured when we come back, the answer is going to be the same. It's because we live in a place affected by sin. So why does this matter? Why talk about something like this? Because many will use illnesses like cancer and natural disasters that occur to attack God's character. What we have done is we have looked at why it protects God's character. Understanding the reasoning for this. He is not randomly striking His children with disease. This kind of discussion is important. It matters because it protects suffering saints from false guilt. Your diagnosis is not your indictment. And it's important because it anchors hope in something real. The brokenness that we feel proves that we were made for something better. Cancer feels wrong because it is wrong. It's not how things were meant to be. It's not how God designed His creation. And one day, because of Jesus, it will not be how things are. Cancer will be gone. Cancer will not affect anybody anymore. You say, well, Kris, that's all well and good, but it's hard here in the immediate presence. I understand it is. When you look at how many that have just barely started living their lives, as we would call it, have that life cut short by diseases like cancer. You say, how? How can I be positive? When you see young men with biblically influenced families, striving to work for the master day in and day out, have that life cut short because of cancer, you say, how? How can I find any peace? It's because we know the perfection of God will once again reign supreme. And we know that we can enjoy that with them when our time comes. It's not going to replace holes that are left by their absence. And I'm not saying it's wrong to feel for their absence. But there's hope. There's hope beyond our grieving. Why cancer? Because this world is broken by sin. And that is not a cop-out answer. But it shows just how serious sin is. is.